Tucker, it's great to see you. I was just talking to my colleagues here about the fact that I had to spend years enduring your harassing me and hectoring me and coercing me to go on your show all those times. And I finally now have a show where I get to turn the tables and do the same to you.
I love it.
But yeah, I'm really delighted to commemorate our year on the air and 200 show by speaking with you. I'm really looking forward to it. Thanks for taking the time to do it.
Well, it's so funny. I woke up thinking about you so weirdly. It have nothing to do with this, but the world has gotten so dark. I literally thought of you within 4 minutes of waking this morning, and I thought, trying to count my blessings. And one of them is everyone's gone so insane. I've lost, most of my friends, but I've really become close to all these remarkable people I never would have been close to otherwise. And you're way up on that list. So thank you.
Yeah, I feel the same. We used to joke all the time about how as recently as 2015, if anyone had said we'd be doing anything like this, we would have told everybody that you're crazy. That's Tucker Carlson. That's Glenn Greenwald. And yet here we are. It's just the nature of the world. All right, let me begin. I obviously want to talk to you about this exciting new venture that you announced, and I'm excited by it, and I'm excited to hear a lot about it. Before we get to that, though, I just want to talk about the context a little bit of where this is going and kind of what caused you to create this. And I want to start by asking the following, which is, I know when I left The Intercept, where if you had asked me the whole time up until the day I left, am I free to say whatever I wanted? I would have said, yeah, absolutely. Nobody ever tells me what to say. Nobody could tell me what to say. I'm totally free. And yet once I left, I felt this liberation that I feel until this very day. Like, obviously, there were all these ways I was constrained subliminally in ways that I didn't really realize. I definitely see this in you, too, in the way that you speak about things and how you speak about them. You just seem happier personally, but also in your work. Yes. I'm wondering if you found that you feel liberated, even though I know at Fox people weren't telling you what to say, but were there chains that were on you that you didn't really realize?
That's so smart, and only someone who's experienced it would know that, and you're absolutely right. Solzhenitsyn writes about this, that one of the costs of an authoritarian structure is what it does to the way you think and the way you permit yourself to think, and that is absolutely what happened to me. And I would always brag about the arrangement I had on Fox, which was real, which I said, it's your channel. If you don't like it, what I'm saying, pull me off, but you can't control what I say while I'm on the air. And they live by that. But I always think of myself as a strong person and a free man, and I'm going to say what I think, and to a large extent I did. But I never appreciated how that affected the way I allowed myself to think. And the second I left, and what a blessing that was, and of course, most of your blessings come in disguise. You don't realize what they are when they happen. But that really was a huge blessing for me. And yes, there were all sorts of things. For one thing, just the structure of television, not just the company I work for, but all of them is inherently partisan. And I'm just not partisan. I never have been partisan. I've never been fully on board. I don't like the Democratic Party. I'm happy to say that. But I've never been for the Republican Party, especially because I don't think they're sincere. I don't think they mean it. I don't think they believe anything, most of them. And yet the structure of cable television is inherently partisan. You can't get out of that. And so I'm happy to say almost all Democrats are bad, but I am not happy to say, and I wouldn't be honest if I said most Republicans are good office holders, because that's not true. They're not good. So that really, I felt a lot freer to express that and to really think about it more deeply. There's no reason that I would have any loyalty to say that the new Speaker of the House, whose literally first public statement after getting that job, third in line from the presidency, was to announce his concern for other countries at a time when our country is really degrading in a scary way.
Yeah, I know that he ascended that tribune and he said, the first thing we're going to do, all of America was listening, what are you going to do? Are you going to reindustrialize the Midwest? Are you going to do something about the fentanyl crisis ravaging our communities? He said, the first thing we're going to do is get a bill passed for our friend Israel. That was the first thing he told Americans we were going to do, is something for a foreign country.
Well, exactly. And it's hardly an attack on Israel to be offended by that if you're an American, which I am, born here. So I thought that was outrageous. And I always would have thought it was outrageous, but I would have thought to myself, well, he's better than the other guy or whatever. Now I just feel like I don't know. It's outrageous. I mean, it doesn't mean he's going to hell or he's a terrible person. That's not up to me to judge, but it means that statement betrays a mindset that is repugnant to me, and I feel totally free to say so, and et cetera. So it's not so much what I was allowed to think, it's the way that you think is heavily influenced by the structure that you live in. And I'm glad to be out of that structure, I will say.
Exactly. I want to ask you now that you're really fully fledged member of the independent media. Welcome to the independent media. I mean, you already were that with your show on Twitter, but now you're really all in.
And tough.
Yeah. And, as somebody who's really been, kind of thinking about this a lot over the past few years, I think one of the really interesting things, too, is just the nature, the structure of how discourse has to happen on television. And actually, the best person who's talked about this is Noam Chomsky, who obviously lots of people have disagreements with in a lot of other ways. Nonetheless, one of the things he once said that I found so insightful is that on television, you have the requirement of concision, meaning you have to make your points in 7 minutes in between commercial breaks, or sometimes you could do 15 or 17 minutes with your monologue, but still, there is a concision requirement, and what he said was that it inherently serves establishment orthodoxy, because if you want to go on TV and say something that most people already think, like, oh, Iran is really evil, and Russia is terrible, and China is repressive, you don't really need much time. People already think that. You just take a few minutes, you say it, everyone nods their head. But if you want to really dig in and challenge establishment orthodoxy in a fundamental way to say, well, what about our own government and or whatever else it is that you want to do, you need time to do it. You don't have that time when you have to speak in between these commercial breaks using the attribute of concision. You did have that longer form show, but it was on your streaming service. I did it once, and I did think it enabled a different kind of conversation. But is that something as well that, looking back, you think constrained you in what you could do?
Hugely. And it's one of the reasons that I got out of debating on TV, which I always really enjoyed. I mean, the real reason I got out was the DNC boycotted me, and so no Democratic member could come on. But after a couple years of not doing those debates, which have been kind of my bread and butter for 25 years on TV, I realized how unhelpful they are, not just because they're contentious. There's nothing wrong with a contentious conversation. We need more. But because they pushed each person into a box that you kind of couldn't get out of. And that form was a lot of the reason for it. So I got away, my out was writing myself like a long form 12-minute open every night where I could just think about it and really say what I wanted to say. But that's a soliloquy, not a colloquy. So I did miss the conversation. And, I don't drive very much. And when I do, I just listen to bluegrass music and space out. So I've never really listened to podcasts in my whole life. And I've done a lot of them now in the past 7 months. I've done a lot of podcasts. What an amazing form that is. Just the structure is amazing because of the lack of time limits and the conversational nature of it. And it just becomes like this incredible experience. It's like the best dinner party you've ever been to, kind of thing. And I've just absolutely loved it. And I can see why, and I'm sure you have the same experience, like the people in my world, the smart people who are really interested in what's going on and sincerely trying to figure out what's true, a lot of them listen to podcasts a lot. And I thought that was weird, but now I understand why. And so the fact that podcasts and long-form independent media are replacing, say, NBC News, which will not exist in 10 years, no chance. That's a good thing. That's a cause for hope. We should be happy, I think.
Yeah, it's funny. I think the first time I was on your show, or one of the first times I was on your Fox show, the segment before me, you were interviewing Adam Schiff about Russiagate, and I remember it so well because all you were doing was saying, hey, you keep asserting these things that the FBI and the CIA leaked to the Washington Post and the New York Times, but there's actually no evidence for it. Do you have evidence for it? And his response was, sounds like you should put your show on RT. And I know at some point you kind of lost the ability to interview Adam Schiff because Democrats wouldn't go on your show. We find the same thing. We've had a lot of members of Congress from the Republican Party on this show. Democratic members of Congress keep saying maybe they will, but most will never come on our show. And so you do have that ability to have this long-form discourse where you can deconstruct people's ideas even though they may not be here for you to confront it. Let me ask you about the cancellation of your show by Fox, because I know you've been asked this before.
Yes.
And I've heard you say, look, I don't know. They didn't give me a reason. I don't know for sure why. And I know that's true. But one of the things we do know for sure is that when your show is canceled, there were a bunch of Republicans in Congress, in the most cowardly way possible, which is their nature, who ran to places like Politico and other outlets to say, we're so happy he's off the air because his opposition to the war in Ukraine made it so much harder for us to fund the war in Ukraine, because a lot of our voters were asking, why are you funding this war on the other side of the world when there's so many problems at home? We also know that by canceling your show, it basically removed the most vocal opponent of the top priority of the U.S. security state, which is the war in Ukraine. It left a couple of people who kind of questioned it, but nowhere near to the extent and with the dedication that you were doing. Do you have any doubts, even though there may be other reasons? I mean, you obviously, it wasn't because of your ratings. You didn't have a scandal that brought down other Fox hosts or other people with top-rated shows before. You didn't have anything like that. So do you have any doubts that your vehement opposition to this war that most establishment Republicans support, that the U.S. security state had as their top priority, was at least a factor in why you got removed from the air?
Again, I have no evidence, but as you said, I also have no doubt. I mean, the explanation that filtered out from wherever the explanations filter out was that I was a racist. Well, I'm actually not a racist. So, and everyone who knows me knows I'm not a racist. So I know it wasn't that. So it was clearly, a position that I was taking of significance that was deeply unpopular in the world that the people who run these companies live in. And I took a position on the vax that they really hated, but that had kind of passed. But the war in Ukraine had not passed. And in fact, it was a kind of a critical point. And my views were really despised. And I know that because I was told that to my face, but never asked to change them, I will say. But it was really clear, like, people don't like this at all. But I didn't stop. And I guess I kind of have to wonder, it's not even about me, and maybe you have a good hypothesis here, but like, what was that exactly? It's not as simple as, people are getting rich from the war. Of course they're getting rich from the war. And of course the weapons manufacturers love the war. They've said so. I get it. They just met with Zelensky yesterday. But that does not explain how the entire American ruling class became emotionally involved in the fortunes of the Ukrainian government. Like that's something much deeper. What was that? It was like some weird dog whistle that only sort of high-income, well-educated people could hear, and they went all in with like religious fervor. Do you have any?
Yeah, I mean, if you go back, it's so interesting from before 2016, so before Russiagate, what you had was the bipartisan political class in Washington really attacking President Obama. It was one of the things on which they most attacked him. When Hillary Clinton wrote her book and had criticisms of Obama, it was almost always about the fact that he was insufficiently militaristic. And particularly, she was so angry that he wouldn't confront Russia more on Syria, on Ukraine. And when Obama gave an interview with Jeffrey Goldberg, Supreme neocon Jeffrey Goldberg, and Jeffrey Goldberg said, why didn't you do more to confront Putin? Obama said something that if you said now, you would be called a Russian agent. Look, we don't have a vital interest in confronting Russia in Syria. We don't have a vital interest in confronting Russia over Ukraine. Yes. Ukraine's not a vital interest to us. And yet you had both John McCain, but then the kind of pro-war Democrats, led by Hillary Clinton, demanding they confront Russia. So there's been this long-term attempt to seize control of eastern Ukraine, to take it away from Russia, to threaten Russia in eastern Ukraine relative to the border. Victoria Nuland worked with in the Clinton State Department, she's now running Ukraine, as you know, for Biden. But then I really think, and I'm wondering if you agree, that what Russiagate did, and the reason I was so opposed to it for so long, wasn't just because it was a fake, manufactured, evidence-free McCarthyite scandal from the CIA to sabotage Trump, although it was that, and that's what made it dangerous. More dangerous was the geopolitical project, was to re-inject this idea into the American bloodstream, which is always kind of latent from the Cold War, that our existential enemy is the Kremlin. Even though Obama was saying we can work with the Kremlin, George Bush said we can work with Putin, Bill Clinton said we can work with Putin, and yet they convinced a lot of Democrats that the reason Trump lost was because of Putin. They kept ratcheting up the hatred for Russia, and I think that's why you combine the kind of long-standing Republican willingness to go to war against enemies, including Moscow, with this newfound Democratic hatred for Russia, and it served this pre-existing geopolitical agenda where the United States wanted to control Eastern Europe, especially Ukraine, and that meant undermining and challenging and weakening Russia.
I agree with every word of that, and I remember that interview very well. And though I don't think much of Obama, I remember thinking he seemed very reasonable in it. And Jeffrey Goldberg, of course, one of the most sinister, dishonest people in the media, in my opinion. But I remember it very well, and I remember thinking, wow, they must hate him for this. But it doesn't answer the question, like, why would you want to be at war with Russia? What is the appeal of hating Russia? I just will speak for myself. I love Tolstoy and Dostoevsky. But that's just, I like the literature of 19th century Russian novelists. I've never been there. I have no strong feelings about the country. So I think I can sort of see it less emotionally than maybe some in Washington. I just don't get it. Why? It's almost like they picked it off a map. Like, why Russia? We won the Cold War. That's not enough. Why do we need to keep fighting them? I think it's very weird.
Yeah, I mean, if you go and, I know, ironically, even though everyone knows you're an agent of the Kremlin, I've heard you say before you've never even been to the country. I have a couple of times, in part because my source and my friend Edward Snowden is there, but I also, find it a super interesting country. It's an incredibly beautiful and cultural place, St. Petersburg and Moscow. It, looks a lot more like Europe than it does like Asia. And Putin, for a long time, wanted a good relationship with the West. He wanted to be part of NATO, in fact, at some point. And I do think it's very strange that the United States deliberately sought out to turn Russia into an enemy. And I agree that all of the reasons aren't entirely clear. All right, let me ask you about this. One of the things that I think is so interesting that you've been doing since you left Fox is that you have been traveling around the world, and not just journalistically, but almost kind of as your own political figure, have been speaking to and meeting with key figures of what's called the international populist right. You already, I think while you were still at Fox, you interviewed the Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban twice, but since then you went to Brazil and interviewed the then President Jair Bolsonaro. You just were in Argentina talking to the newly elected President Javier Milei. You were just in Spain, meeting with the right-wing leaders of that country, the right-wing opposition leaders. And if you look at all these figures, like doctrinally on foreign policy, economic policy, cultural issues even, they have a lot of differences. But I feel like there's this sort of common appeal politically, this common ethos that ties them together and permits you to kind of locate them on this coherent, as a part of a coherent political movement, the international populist right. I'm wondering if you agree with that, and if so, what do you see that's common among these figures, not necessarily in terms of their beliefs, but why they're appealing to voters?
Well, I mean, I agree with the first part of your question, which is there's a lot that's different about them. I mean, to be right-wing in Spain is very different from being right-wing in Great Britain or anywhere else in Europe, in Portugal even, or in Hungary, or much less the United States. So, there are many, many differences. But here are the things that I believe they all have in common, and not just in Europe, but in Latin America and, by the way, in the world's emerging power center, which is the Gulf. And there are these things. One, there's the recognition that the post-war order is collapsing and deserves to, because it no longer serves really anybody except a small group, okay? So it just doesn't work. These are aging institutions created to respond to threats that no longer exist, to govern a world that no longer exists, and so of course they need to be updated. One. Two, and the U.S. is at the center of that, so we're actually going to lose in this transition, but I'm just noting this as objectively as possible. Two, neoliberalism, which really is the global religion at this point, doesn't serve the populations of these countries very well. It doesn't increase living standards or happiness. Suicide rates are way up. And as one measure of that, wages are frozen. So it doesn't actually work. So you have two options. Either you're going to just get rid of the pretense of democracy and have some kind of authoritarian system where you just force people to eat their gruel and shut up, or you change the system. So they're all very suspicious of that. And the third thing they all have in common is kind of a mild nationalism, not a scary goose-stepping nationalism, but a literal nationalism, like a belief that my country's different. It may share interests with other countries, but they don't always overlap. And in the end, if I'm elected democratically to represent my citizens, I should do that. And I should be more loyal to their interests than to the interests of some international body like the UN, or, the World Health Organization, or the WEF, or whatever. I should be loyal to my country because my job is to govern my country on behalf of my country's citizens. These are very simple, moderate concepts, in my opinion, and there's nothing radical about any of that. But it's so interesting that ghouls in Washington, people who are supposed to be smart people, I'm thinking specifically of Ann Applebaum, but the entire roster at the Atlantic magazine, who are purportedly the smartest people in our society, and spoiler alert, they're not. Actually, they're some of the least impressive people in our society. But anyway, see that as so unbelievably dangerous and scary and radical, when of course it's the opposite of any of those things. It really reveals the radicalism and the darkness in our leadership. I mean, it kind of is a mirror holding up to the face of the State Department. And it's like, if you think it's scary for a country in a gentle way to say, I'd rather make friends than more, I'd rather increase the living standards of my population than fund somebody else's country. If you think that's bad, then guess what? You're bad. That's my view anyway.
Yeah, I mean, it's so interesting. The Atlantic is such a perfect representation of, I think, like the rotted, sickening face of the Washington establishment. I mean, for one thing, it's run by Jeffrey Goldberg, who got caught spreading total conspiracy theories. He was the one who convinced Americans that Saddam Hussein had a alliance with Osama bin Laden, which led Americans to assume that we must be going to war with Iraq because Saddam Hussein planned the 9/11 attack. He won national magazine awards for that fake conspiracy theory, and then the Atlantic became ground zero for Russiagate, and you have all these people whose careers are just filled with bloodshed based on lies. But also, what they have really done is, in the name of claiming that Trump is this grave existential threat to democracy and to liberty, they have united the power centers, and the media has become a critical part of it, in suppressing core democratic values like free speech. They're huge advocates of censorship. They're weaponizing the justice system to try and imprison the person leading the presidential polls. They've really convinced themselves that their authoritarianism is just because they believe they're the only guardians of democracy. Or do you think they really have convinced themselves of this kind of messianic mission that they're on, to save democracy by becoming tyrannical because you can't trust people to know what's in their best interest, this kind of populism? Or do you think they're more consciously corrupted in what they're doing?
You know, I'm in the weird position where I know them. You know, I know a lot of them personally. I mean, I've had meals with them, and I lived there for my whole life. So I don't know the answer for certain, but I have a couple theories. One, well, first let me say it's totally sincere. They mean it. I mean, Ann Applebaum means it, and I know her, and she's like, you know, I don't think she thinks of herself as a terrible person. I'm sure her kids love her. I don't think she's Stalin. I'm not saying that, but effectively she's arguing for a totalitarian state. And why is she doing that? And I think there are two reasons. One, she does have, and they all have, this kind of unshakable belief in their superiority because they went to National Cathedral School and Cornell or something. I mean, they really are all midwits, very much including her, but they believe that they've ascended to the top of our system out of merit. Okay, that's the first thing they believe. The second thing they believe is that they're in danger. They're hysterical because they're afraid. Now, why are they afraid? It's obvious that they're afraid. Frank Foer, you know, who was my editor at one point at the New Republic, who's a very thoughtful and very smart person, and a nice person, actually, has become a hysterical, like completely hysterical, and arguing for totalitarianism. Why is that? And I don't know. I haven't talked to him. He would never talk to me again. But I think they feel that the jig is up, kind of onto them. And if they allow democracy to proceed in, say, the presidential race in this country, they're going to be in deep trouble. I think that they think they've gone too far. Like they've done too much to stop the populist movement. And if they allow it to succeed, like there's going to be a reckoning. And I think they feel that on an animal level, and they're terrified. They're clearly terrified. I don't know if you read the last special issue of The Atlantic, but it's panic.
Yeah,
okay?
It's self-terror. Yeah, I mean, yeah. Right. In the Washington Post saying,
right,
we're really headed to dictatorship. I mean, the rhetoric is really ramped up now. And I agree that they, you know, actually do believe it. They've talked themselves into it. And I think, you know, I hate this, like, constant comparison of everybody we don't like to Nazis. So I say this not to do that, but
Yes.
Hannah Arendt observed when she watched the Nuremberg trials what she called the banality of evil. That like you think that people who are doing evil things and tyrannical things have horns growing out of their head and are like fangs with blood dripping out of it. And usually they're just kind of like very mild personalities who get swept up into their own righteousness and have no ability to see what it is they're doing. And I think most of all, they know the public hates them. They know the public doesn't listen to them anymore. In fact, the public, if they hear them saying something, wants to do the opposite, which is why Trump being indicted actually has politically strengthened him, because people don't trust the guardians of these systems, like the people at the Atlantic and like the people who are in D.C. Let me just ask you about one more question before we get to your new media outlet, because I do think you're.
Wait, can I just interject for one thing and just say about one of the great shocks for me as an aging man is to see Hannah Arendt and Sigmund Freud written out of the public conversation. Both of them were huge when I was a kid. Smart people read Sigmund Freud or talked about Sigmund Freud or underwent Freudian analysis and read Hannah Arendt. And both of them are so unfashionable now for reasons that no one will specify. I'm sure my kids have never heard of either one of them. And why is that? Because both of them had a deeper analysis of human motive. Both of them were concerned with why people do things. And in general, we've kind of given up trying to figure out why people do things. Well, why is that? Because the people doing things don't want their motives analyzed. That's why. And so Hannah Arendt, whatever you think of her, was like a very honest observer of people, like too honest for today's discourse. And I have to say, if Hannah Arendt were around, I think she would judge the Atlantic very harshly. And I mean that.
Yeah, I'm always fascinated by this kind of underlying motive. I talk, Adam Smith in The Wealth of Nations in 1776 warned about this human desire to go to war as long as the people who get to order the wars get to stay safe in imperial capitals, that they get this kind of pulsating sense of amusement and purpose and strength, and how they don't actually want the war to end because they love to read the papers and see all the conquering achievements of this army, of their army, while they stay safe. And I mean, nothing is more relevant to our current political culture than that psychoanalysis before psychoanalysis even existed. Let me just ask you, I do want to get to this new media outlet, because I think one of the reasons they're scared is because they see the ascension of new media that they have no ability to control, of independent media. But just before we get there, just one last question about this international right that really interests me, which is, you and I have talked a lot about how like Trump's America First politics and this agenda have changed foreign policy, the foreign policy thinking of the American right in so many ways. He ran against Bush-Cheney wars and neoconservatism, and it opened up all this space to question the CIA and be skeptical of the FBI in a way that I'd never seen before in the American right. But it also kind of transformed economic policy. He frequently kind of denounced the classic sort of Reaganomics, this idea that, we should all cheer for the richest people in our society to get richer because a rising tide lifts all boats. And everybody watches Raytheon and Boeing and BlackRock and Amazon get richer and richer and richer, and their boats aren't rising. And it really led a lot of people who have been capitalists their whole lives to at least start questioning not capitalism as a theory, but capitalism, how it manifests in American society. What is your view about sort of where the populist right is, the Trump movement is, when it comes to these core questions of economic theory and economic populism?
I think a lot of people have awakened to the now demonstrable fact that libertarian economics was a scam perpetrated by the beneficiaries of the economic system that they were defending. So they created this whole intellectual framework to justify the private equity culture that's hollowed out the country. That's my personal view, and I've seen it up close my whole life, so I think it's a fair assessment. I think a smarter way to assess an economic system is by its results. So you can assign whatever name you want to the economic system of the United States. You could call it market capitalism. You could call it a whole host of different things. But I don't think any of that's useful. Those are boring conversations. I think you need to ask, does this economic system produce a lot of dollar stores? And if it does, it's not a system that you want, because it degrades people and it makes their lives worse, and it increases exponentially the amount of ugliness in your society. And anything that increases ugliness is evil. And it's just let's just start there. So if it's such a good system, why do we have all these dollar stores? Dollar store is the clear. I mean, it's not the only ugly thing being created in the United States, but it's one of the most common, and it's certainly the most obvious. So if you have a dollar store, you're degraded. And any town that has a dollar store does not get better; it gets worse. And the people who live there lead lives that are worse. So, and the counter argument, to the extent there is one, oh, they buy cheaper stuff. Great, but they become more unhappy. And the dollar store itself is a sort of symbol. What's a physical thing? It's a real thing. It's not just a metaphor, but it's also a metaphor for your total lack of control over where you live and over the imposition of aggressively in-your-face ugly structures that send one message to you, which is you mean nothing. You are a consumer, not a human being or a citizen. And so, again, I don't know what we call our current system, but its effects are grotesque. They're grotesque. It's wrecked. I've been here 54 years and I watch carefully. That's my only gift, is I watch. And this has become a much uglier place, a much more crowded place, a much more hostile place, a place that cares much less about people. So whatever system that produces that outcome is a bad system. And you can call me whatever you want. Oh, you're a socialist. I don't care what you call me, actually. I'm beyond caring about name calling. It's bad, and I oppose it.
Yeah, believe me, I know. I got in a lot of trouble once for suggesting that you and Steve Bannon are a lot more socialist in a certain limited sense than a lot of people who claim that title. And of course, the nuance of that point got completely lost. But I do think the fact that you are focused so much on kind of the welfare of ordinary people, and you go to anywhere in the world, you go to Western Europe and you see these structures that people spent 200 years building just for the sheer beauty of it. Yes. And you go into nature and you see beauty like it never exists. And you go to developing countries and you see a kind of dedication to buildings even that are designed to be inspiring and to kind of stimulate things in the human soul. And then you go to the places in the United States where our infrastructure is falling apart, where our new structures are designed to be as ugly as possible. And it's a very difficult thing to do, to communicate these sort of spiritual components of our politics, but ultimately politics does have no purpose other than to elevate the happiness of our citizenry, and by every metric, the happiness of our citizenry is declining. Suicide, addiction, use of antidepressants, all of that. Thanks for watching this clip from System Update, our live show that airs every Monday through Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern, exclusively on Rumble. You can catch the full nightly shows live or view the backlog of episodes for free on our Rumble page. You can also find full episodes the morning after they air across all major podcasting platforms, including Spotify and Apple. All the information you need is linked below. We hope to see you there.